Greetings and welcome to the next instalment of Bond University's Now Talks. My name is Associate Professor Darryl McPhee and I'm an Associate Professor of Environmental Management here on the wonderful Gold Coast. Now to begin with, let's reflect how lucky many of us are to live in southeast Queensland. If you don't live here, you need to visit now. If you're looking for somewhere to study, this is the place for you, I can guarantee it. Whether it's for a whole degree or a study abroad, then you need to be here. Now the region I'm talking about extends from Caloundra in the north, that's north of Bribie Island there on the map, and southwards to the Gold Coast, and of course includes our capital city Brisbane. And our area is known as a 200-kilometre city. It's a more or less linear settlement that tightly hugs and encircles the western shoreline of Moreton Bay. Now the region is home to about 3 million people now, and is projected to increase to 4 to 5 million by 2013. From an environmental perspective, it's a very important area. It's biogeographically unique. It's a melting pot, it's the mixing area of both tropical and temperate fauna, and it represents the southernmost geographic limit of a number of species, including a multitude of species that generally call the Great Barrier Reef home. Now let's look at a couple of photos of some real students exploring some of the wonderful environments locally with me. Here we are out and about exploring a vibrant wetland, in this case a stand of mangroves in crystal clear water at North Stradbroke Island. There are 6 species of mangroves in Moreton Bay, and overall the area of mangroves has held up pretty well over time. Although the area where mangroves has grown has changed substantially since European settlement. Some areas have lost mangroves, some areas have gained mangroves. Now not everyone knows this, but Moreton Bay is home to significant coral reefs, and it represents the southernmost limit on the mainland where recognisable coral reefs occur. And by way of remarkable comparison, there are 115 species of corals just on one reef in Moreton Bay, that's Flinders Reef. The whole of Hawaii only has 45 species, and the whole of the Caribbean has only 55 species. So I can take you to one local reef and show you more species of coral than you will see throughout the whole of the Caribbean and the whole of Hawaii. That's how immensely diverse our local coral community is. Here are a group of students exploring and assessing the intertidal flats, which ecologically are critical habitats wherever they occur, and they're very widespread in our region. Now, Moreton Bay is recognised as a Ramsar site, so it's an internationally listed wetland of international importance, and it's only one of only a very small handful of such locations in Queensland. And part of this recognition is because of areas like this, which are critical habitat, critical feeding and roosting habitats for various shorebirds, including a whole range of birds that are of international significance. Slightly different tact, here is an area of bushland called Wallam Country. So it's a type of vegetation that grows on sandy soils along the coastline, and in particular 2 large islands of Moreton and North Stradbroke Island. It's a very diverse area. Lots of specialised plants grow here, including plants that are very important as indigenous food sources. There is the swamp fern, which is called bungwal, where indigenous women can collect the roots, grind it up and use it for flour to make johnny cakes. And also the midgeonberry, which is a small berry the size of blueberries, which is absolutely delicious. We have a number of typical Australian species, typical Australian mammals that hang out in our area, including the koala, a favourite of locals and visitors alike. And hanging out at the beach is an Australian tradition, and it's not just for the people, but also the animals. And here's a koala just hanging out, having his holiday at the beach. It's not just on land where the charismatic animals are, and this is not a Photoshop. This is an actual dolphin jumping over a sunset. It's a 1 in a million shot. Moreton Bay has significant populations of bottlenose dolphins and Australian humpback dolphins. Point Lookout on North Stradbroke Island has the largest single bottlenose dolphin population in the world of between 700 and 1,000 animals. It's not just it's not just dolphins, we also have dugongs, the very large herbivorous mammal, the sea cow. Dugongs occur in Moreton Bay, they are abundant in Moreton Bay, and Moreton Bay represents the southernmost distribution of dugongs on the Australian east coast, and the population is of global significance. Globally, there are 7 species of marine turtles. 3 of those frequently occur in Moreton Bay: the loggerhead turtle, the green turtle, and the hawksbill turtle. And another turtle species, the flatback turtle, which is endemic, nesting is endemic to Australia, also occurs in Moreton Bay. And we shouldn't forget about what it means to people as well. Moreton Bay has very vibrant recreational and commercial fisheries, and in particular is a fantastic venue for family fishing. Fishing has important social benefits, particularly for children, where it can encourage them to be more environmentally aware, become more balanced individuals, and also it's very good at building generational bonds and facilitating the transfer of knowledge across generations. Fishing was a mindfulness activity long before mindfulness entered the psychological lexicon. Now on to what I've done. I've completed, and some background to this works. My next book is The Environmental History and Ecology of Moreton Bay. As well as my formal training, I believe I'm a bit of a unique situation because I've spent over 30 years on Moreton Bay in all sorts of conditions, doing all sorts of things. I've seen it change, sometimes for the better, sometimes less so. My philosophy is threefold. First, you cannot develop an understanding of a large, diverse and unique environment such as Moreton Bay just by looking at an abstract computer model or by spending a few days counting some animals. You need to have deep engagement. Secondly, you cannot divorce people from the environment. We are linked, people and place. We're part of the environment, part of the problem, yes, but also part of the solution. There are no solutions without people. And third, and somewhat allied to that previous point, you must look at an understanding of Moreton Bay from an integrated and multidisciplinary perspective at different spatial scales and different temporal scales. And here are some of the disciplines I've touched on. Obviously not going to go through them all, but you need to think about and have an understanding of the natural environment. Zoology, the animals; botany, the plants. You need to have an understanding of physical sciences. So we've got the natural sciences and then the physical sciences. So geology, geomorphology, water chemistry, oceanography. Then you have a whole lot of people-orientated disciplines that are important as well. Public health, archaeology, anthropology, and psychology. So they're all the elements that you need to look at Moreton Bay. Moreton Bay, of course, hasn't always been here, and even in relatively recent geological history. And in fact, in geological timescales, Moreton Bay is ephemeral. It comes and it goes. Now, if we look very quickly at and very generally at geological timescales, the Pleistocene extends from 2.6 million years ago to 11.7 thousand years before present. Then we have the Holocene period, which extends from 11,700 years to now. And patterns of sea level change dictate that Moreton Bay can only exist for a few thousand of years every 100,000 years or so. Present day Moreton Bay formed as the sea level rose from the last glacial maximum. So once upon a time, the shoreline of Moreton Bay was where that yellow line is, so nearly to the current continental shelf. And I'll come back to sort of what that means, particularly from an Indigenous perspective. So what Moreton Bay is now is a large river valley traversed by several large rivers that emptied into the ocean a long, long way from where they do now. So pretty much everything that's in less than 150 metres of water now was dry. It was terrestrial environment. So we have these long-term changes. We also have some relatively short-term changes. So here is an area of North Stradbroke Island. This is Amity Point, so near the township. And you can see this from this photo. There's a large sand spit there. and behind it some deeper water. So this was in 2004. In 2010, shifting sands, very different habitat. The spit's broken down, the deeper water behind the spit has now become infilled with sand, and the mangroves behind the sand spit have been choked and have died. So very significant natural environmental change within a very short period of time. So we have these long-term changes, then shorter term changes. So this is North Stradbroke Island. This is Point Lookout, looking down along the length of Main Beach. As you can see from this photo, it's a very important area for tourism, but its history of human use is much, much longer. Aboriginal people have inhabited and utilised the natural resources of what is now an island for at least 22,000 years. When the sea level was low during the Pleistocene, the Aboriginal people of North Stradbroke Island sat upon the very large sand dunes and looked out to the east across a very large coastal plain and looked to the west across the river valley, which is now Moreton Bay. The Bay Islands were not islands, they were just higher points in the landscape. As the sea level rose, successive populations would have seen the coastal plain diminish, and by about 6,000 years ago, the large dune of what is now North Stradbroke Island became the island. And Indigenous people responded to these rapidly changing environments and rapidly changing access to various food resources. So a long occupation of North Stradbroke Island. Moreton Island, this is Cape Moreton on Moreton Island, was something different. When the island formed as the sea level rose, Aboriginal people are thought to have largely abandoned this area, probably due to a lack of large land mammals and perhaps a shoreline that wasn't particularly conducive to fishing approaches that were available at the time. The island though was resettled about 2,300 years before present, probably from North Stradbroke Island, and it became a very important trading place, particularly this area here, Cape Moreton. For the Indigenous people of Moreton Island, Cape Moreton, it was the critical area. Very diverse rock types, it's an important quarry location, and Indigenous people travelled from all over southeast Queensland to trade for rock from Cape Moreton. So it was a very important trading post. Trade, exchange, negotiation. So these are what I mentioned before. So these are dugong. Among the marine food resources relied upon by Aboriginal people, an animal of significance both in terms of nutrition and culture was the dugong. Now people in Moreton Bay were different. They didn't use the techniques to harvest dugong like people further north, who generally used spears. They used nets. And our knowledge of exactly what Aboriginal people did is far from perfect, because Aboriginal stories, traditions weren't written down, but occasionally something was captured by an early settler, and we have that for dugong. So an early settler captured Aboriginal dugong fishermen at Bribie Island, and this is what was said. Dugong were caught in certain seasons. The clansmen would venture out at night on the full moon and rising tide. As the sea advanced even further, 2 lookouts might be posted. They would climb the tall bloodwood trees to watch for the young'un, the dugong. As the lookouts scouted, the dugong would make towards the banks near the shore, where they could graze on marine plants. Being herbivorous, the animal would leave small trails of broken plant material floating up on the water, a message to the Jundabari people, that's the Aboriginal people of Bribie Island, that dugong were close by and that it was time to go fishing. It wasn't just the Aboriginal people that used and hunted dugong, a very significant dugong fishery by Europeans. So you used to be able to go into the equivalent of a supermarket in Brisbane and buy dugong oil, dugong meat, hides, tusks and bone. The hides was high quality leather. It was also used in engine belts and carriage brakes. And in the day, dugong oil was the cure oil. There was nothing that allegedly dugong oil couldn't cure, from male baldness to a cure for tuberculosis. So let's look at Brisbane, our capital city of Queensland. Now the genesis of Brisbane and its development is intimately linked to the river. Now it provided the key transport corridor for the early settlers, and the meanders of the river provided suitable areas for settlement, which later became suburbs that coalesced into the large city. So the suburbs formed where they formed due to the biophysical environment, and in particular due to the Brisbane River. Now, the earliest export of the Brisbane penal colony was for timber, which was floated downstream and then shipped to Sydney. The first mining activity undertaken was coal. Coal was discovered in Ipswich in 1825, and mining commenced in 1843, with most of the mining occurring around the river and the coal shipped downriver. But the Brisbane River that was the province of the Indigenous people and that the early European settlers gazed upon was very, very different from the one today. And it is recorded in the words of a Turrbal man, Turrbal being the Indigenous owners of the Brisbane area. I and all others people spent a great deal of time near the river and the many ponds and swamps which are never far from reach. From our place, Meanjin, which is now known as Garden Point, we often cross the river, either swimming or in canoes, to Woolloongabba, or Whirling Waters. The clear sandy beach on that side of the river is excellent for fishing, and the children love playing there. While staying there, we live on the high ridges of a long swamp. That's actually along Cordelia Street at South Brisbane, and along a whole series of waterholes at Woolloongabba. The river always provides many different fish, crayfish, mussels and tortoises. Black swans, ducks and other water birds also make good food, and their eggs are excellent too. So the weight of evidence suggests a very substantial and a series of cumulative impacts, so not just one source of impacts, but a series of cumulative impacts that probably started taking root in the after the First World War and continued. But fortunately, I have witnessed substantial improvements in the environmental quality, water quality, and overall the quality of the Brisbane River as a whole. We're not there yet, and it's far from pristine, but there has been substantial improvements. Now, the Brisbane River does something else. And in 2011, we got a reminder that the Brisbane River floods episodically. It always has, and will continue to do so. All we can do is hope to minimise the loss of life and the damage to property. Now, as bad as the 2011 floods were, they pale into insignificance compared to what happened in 1893, the so-called Great Flood, or the Black February flood. So the measured flood peak is shown here, and it dwarfs anything since, even the disastrous 1974 flood. The loss of life from this flood in the 1890s was significant, about 35 people, and remembering the population of Brisbane then was very small, and the damage to the growing settlement at Brisbane was profound, and here's the main streets of Brisbane flooded, but its environmental impacts would actually be much longer lasting. Let's forget gold. Between 1870 and 1900, Queensland was fuelled by the oyster rush. There was an oyster rush was much more significant than any gold rush. And at the time of the European settlement, much of the inshore areas of Moreton Bay was dominated by oysters. It wasn't dominated by mud, it wasn't dominated by seagrass, it was dominated by oysters. The shells were used to make lime for construction, so many of the early buildings in Brisbane, oyster shells were an important component of the lime. There's also a myriad of fashionable oyster saloons in Brisbane, Fortitude Valley, and this example here in Sandgate. So this was the forerunner of our cafe culture. You didn't gather for a latte or a flat white, you gathered at an oyster saloon. Fortunes were made on the back of the oyster shell. But at the time of the 1893 floods, the catchment had been newly cleared without knowledge of agricultural practices appropriate for the landscape, and erosion had been observed very early. But the giant flood deposited approximately 3.5 metres of sediment into the inshore area, including Pumice-Stone Passage. Oysters once covered those areas. They were buried under 3.5 metres of sediment, and they've actually never recovered because the environment is no longer conducive to their growth. This is a pattern of oyster loss that is seen globally. They are the most threatened ecosystem in the world. Forget corals, oyster reefs are the most threatened marine ecosystem in the world. Why don't we know too much about them? Generational amnesia. We didn't have social media to document loss. We didn't have much at all. We had a few historic records which I pieced together. Had this loss been occurring now, we would have had Save Our Oyster campaigns everywhere. But we didn't. What's lost has been lost. This was perhaps the last oyster clump in Pumicestone Passage. It's since toppled over. You might be able to notice there's no growth of oysters on the base or along the column itself, only at the top. Oysters now in Moreton Bay only grow in the intertidal area where they can spend a significant amount of time out of water. Once upon a time, they would have grown all along that column there. Let's look at tourism. Tourism has existed virtually since the start of European settlement. As early as the 1870s, Sandgate, Cleveland, Redcliffe and Wynnum were early tourism meccas as residents travelled there on day trips, particularly as train transportation opened up the area. Sandgate was known as the premier beach resort for people of Brisbane and elsewhere, with this particular pier being the focal point. While the moniker of Premier Beach Resort is no longer apt for Sandgate, the pier has been rebuilt and still functions in terms of an important tourism focus. This location was also a tourist mecca. This was Bishop Island, which was actually man-made. It was man-made between 1909 and 1912 from dredged material from deepening the mouth of the Brisbane River. It was all put on one spot and an island was created. It housed a kiosk, a dance hall, and was a regular haunt for day trippers. But you can't go there now because it doesn't exist. It's gone. It's been incorporated into a much larger development, the Port of Brisbane. So the port created the island, but in the end the port took it away. Legitimate reasons for trade, for our ever-growing population. Other islands in Moreton Bay had different histories. There was St Helena Island, which is a brutal convict prison. It was looked at pretty favourably in the day because it became self-sufficient. So through hard labour, rocks and clay were quarried, oysters were burnt in kilns for lime, the scrub was cleared, land was cultivated and crops grown. The island was declared a historical monument in 1979. The ruins still stand today, and it was the first such declaration as a historical monument in Queensland. This is slightly different. From 1907 through to 1960, Queensland operated Australia's largest lazaret for people afflicted with Hansen's disease, or it is more commonly and colloquially known as leprosy. Buildings from this era also still remain, and they are listed on the Queensland Heritage Register. Patients were not prisoners though. You just couldn't leave. You were free to leave at any time, it's just that you couldn't leave. Males and females were segregated, but given the number of births recorded on the island, there's two hypotheses. One, it was a globally significant location for immaculate conception, or the segregation was less than 100% effective. And as it was found out later, bad luck if you're on the island because the strain of leprosy wasn't actually contagious. So you were wrongfully imprisoned. Not that it was a prison, because you could leave at any time. The Second World War came to the doorstep of the region in 1943 when the vessel the Centaur was sunk, and its final resting place took a long time to find. It was only found in 2009. The ship sinking was regarded as a war crime. It was a hospital ship, clearly marked as such, so it was a Red Cross ship. And of the 322 souls on board, only 64 survived. So it was full of nurses, doctors and wounded soldiers. And it became a focal point of propaganda aimed at bolstering the war effort under the slogan, "Avenge the Nurses." Elements of the war can still be seen elsewhere. Bribie Island was a vital cog in the potential defence of Brisbane. American garrisons were stationed on Bribie Island, and the island became generally off limits to holiday makers. There were a number of gun emplacements, observation posts, searchlights and other military buildings on the northern part of Bribie Island, such as this one here. They still survive. Others can be seen on Moreton Island as well. After the war, returned servicemen were looking for work, and many of them found them in various maritime industries. And a post-World War II demand for whale oil products promoted a resurgence of the whaling industry. And Queensland's only whaling station began operation at Tangalooma on Moreton Island in 1952. Chosen because it had good fresh water, close proximity to Brisbane, and close proximity to lots of migrating humpback whales. It had a short tenure. It was closed in 1962, and it wasn't closed because as a community, as a society, we decided we liked whales. It was closed purely due to economic reasons. The whale population was depressed, they became harder to catch, and the whale products were replaced by other things. For example, the thing that you least expect to find whale in is margarine, but margarine had whale oil in it. And that's of course since been replaced with vegetable oils. So let's not kid ourselves that we just became more environmentally friendly and stopped whaling. We stopped whaling because nobody could make any money from it. And this is the Gateway Bridge. And when we drive over the first Gateway Bridge, there's two of them now, might need to stop and think that this bridge is actually made in part from dredged coral reefs from Moreton Bay. So coral reefs were destroyed to create the Gateway Bridge, and this was as late as the 1980s. So unlike whaling, this was the case where change in public opinion finally resulted in the cessation of coral mining in Moreton Bay. So think about it now, if the government actually planned to create a piece of public infrastructure, a bridge, by destroying coral reefs. It just wouldn't fly. So we actually have changed as a community, our approach to certain issues. So that's some history of a few things, very important things in my opinion. There's lots of other things, but there's so much I can do in a short space of time. But let's look at a couple of what now questions. Oyster restoration, restoration of upper catchments, and leave some animals alone. So restoration of oysters is possible. So I mentioned that loss of oyster reefs is a global problem. And here's some oyster restoration efforts in Florida. So particularly in the US, oyster restoration is a very significant attempt at restoration, which isn't always successful, but we learn from each time it's done. There's a lot of interest north of Brisbane in Palmerston Passage, and a lot of community groups are getting involved in wanting to do some oyster restoration. So it is a way of returning and improving the ecosystem. It's doable. Not only does it create reefs, it also improves water quality. And that can aid also what needs to happen in the upper catchments. So we have a lot of science now which shows where the sediment that ends up in Moreton Bay comes from. And there are certain part of the catchments that are highly erodible, where lots of sediment comes from. So they're the areas that you need to restore as a matter of priority. Here's a typical gully that you'll find upstream. So the early agriculture, when removed a lot of the riparian vegetation, so the vegetation along the gully lines and the creek lines, and this has resulted in lots of sediments washing into the creeks, then into the rivers, and then into the Moreton Bay. But we can fix this issue, and we're going a long way to fixing it. This is a bit of an odd issue. This looks like a pretty good photo, nice tourism photo. This is an actual illegal activity, and it's one that you can find all over YouTube. Dolphins in Moreton Bay are protected. You can't feed them. It's bad for them for a number of reasons. Adult dolphins don't pay enough attention to their calves and don't teach their calves how to hunt properly. Dolphins become used to associating people with food and may go into dangerous situations such as following a large ferry. People touch dolphins, poke them, prod them, all for their own gratification. We need to rethink how we're actually handling the actual creator spirit for the Quandamooka people, the creator spirit for the Aboriginal people. Look, but don't molest. Leave them alone. It's simple, but it's not a message, despite lots of signage, it's not a message that's getting through. This is not ecotourism, this is eco-vandalism. So that's all from me today. Happy to answer questions either in the room or online. I think there might be a couple.
There's definitely a question. Do we know the size of the oyster reefs in the bay?
These days, oysters only grow within the intertidal area and scattered around the place. We don't know perfectly where they used to grow, but it's fair to say that they probably covered somewhere between 60 or 70% of the entire western shoreline of Moreton Bay, but particularly prevalent in Palmerston Passage, the South Port Broadwater, and the inside of South Stradbroke Island around the jump and pin area. So they were extremely extensive. Thank you, thanks for tuning in. Sorry again for our technical issues. We'll post a recording of the full talk shortly. Thank you.